He bought her from a brothel, but what he wanted was a family, not a woman. Nobody in Cedar Ridge saw it coming. When Marcus Thompson walked through those saloon doors with $500 in his weathered hands, every person in that smoke-filled room thought they knew exactly what kind of man he was. The piano stopped playing. The card games froze. Even the bartender stopped wiping down glasses. But Marcus wasn't like the other men who visited Madame Lorraine's establishment. He wasn't there for what everyone thought he was there for. What he wanted would shock this entire frontier town and change two lives forever. The year was 1873. The American West was still wild, still dangerous, still full of broken dreams and desperate people trying to carve out a life in the unforgiving wilderness. Cedar Ridge sat like a dusty jewel between two mountain ranges, where the railroad brought hope and heartbreak in equal measure. Marcus Thompson stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. His hands were calloused from years of ranch work, his face weathered by sun and wind. But his eyes held something different, something gentle, something that didn't belong in a place like this. The floorboards creaked under his boots as he approached Madame Lorraine's desk. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and cheap perfume. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the faded wallpaper. This wasn't a place for gentle eyes or kind hearts. Madame Lorraine looked up from her ledger book, her painted lips curving into a practiced smile. She'd seen men like Marcus before, lonely ranchers with money burning holes in their pockets. Or so she thought. "Well, well," she said, her voice smooth as whiskey. "What can I do for you, cowboy?" Marcus cleared his throat. His hat was in his hands now, and he was turning it nervously. "I hear you got a girl named Sarah here. Sarah Mitchell." Lorraine's eyebrows shot up. Men didn't usually ask for specific girls by their real names. They pointed at pretty faces or described what they wanted. This was different. "Sarah? Now that's interesting. Most men don't care what our girls are called. What's your business with her?" Marcus took a deep breath. The smell of dust and desperation filled his lungs. Outside, a horse whinnied in the distance. The wind rattled the windows like ghostly fingers trying to get in. "I want to buy her freedom." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Every conversation in the room died. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to tick louder. Madame Lorraine's practiced smile faltered. "Come again?" "Her freedom. I want to pay her debt and take her out of here. For good." Now the whispers started. Men leaned across tables, sharing looks of confusion and curiosity. A few women peered around doorways, their faces painted with rouge and disbelief. Madame Lorraine set down her pen carefully. Her business mind was working, calculating, trying to figure out the angle. Nobody bought girls just to set them free. There was always something else. "That girl owes me $800. Food, room, clothes, protection. It's not cheap keeping these girls safe in a town like this." Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. The coins inside clinked together like wind chimes. "I got $500 here, cash money, and I'll work off the rest." "Work off the rest?" Lorraine laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing. I can fix things, build things, protect this place. I'm good with my hands, and better with a gun." The truth was, Marcus Thompson had been saving every penny for 3 years. He'd sold his prize bull, worked double shifts at the railroad, and lived on beans and hardtack just to get this money together. But nobody in that room knew why. Nobody knew about the letter he'd received 6 months ago. Sarah Mitchell appeared at the top of the stairs like an angel descending into hell. She was 22 years old, with honey-colored hair that caught the lamplight. Her dress was blue silk, expensive looking but worn around the edges. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they held a sadness that could break a man's heart in two. She'd heard her name being spoken downstairs. In a place like this, that usually meant trouble. "Sarah?" Madame Lorraine called up. "Come down here, honey. Someone wants to meet you." Sarah's bare feet made no sound on the wooden stairs. She moved like a ghost, careful not to make noise, careful not to attract attention, but every eye in the room was on her anyway. When she reached the bottom, she saw Marcus standing there with his hat in his hands, and his eyes full of something she hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. "This gentleman says he knows you," Lorraine said, watching Sarah's face carefully. Sarah studied Marcus. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. His face was kind, his stance gentle. He didn't look at her the way most men did. He looked at her like she was a person, not a thing. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't remember you." Marcus smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "You wouldn't. You were just 7 years old when I last saw you." The room fell silent again. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. 7? Sarah's hand went to her throat. A memory flickered in her mind like a candle flame in the dark. "Your daddy was Thomas Mitchell. He had a farm about 20 miles north of here. You had a brother named Danny, and a dog named Rusty, who used to chase chickens around the yard." Sarah's knees nearly gave out. She grabbed the stair railing to steady herself. The memories came flooding back like a river, breaking through a dam. Her father, her little brother, the farm with the red barn and the old oak tree where she used to read books on summer afternoons. The day the fever took her parents. The day strangers came and took her away. "Marcus," she whispered. "Marcus Thompson, you lived on the next farm over." "That's right." His voice was gentle, like he was talking to a frightened animal. "Your daddy and I were good friends. When the fever took your folks, I tried to find you, but by the time I got back from driving cattle to market, you and Danny were gone." The tears started then. 15 years of buried pain and lost hope came pouring out of her. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed like her heart was breaking all over again. Marcus took a step forward, then stopped. He wanted to comfort her, but he knew better than to touch her without permission. Not in this place, not after what she'd probably been through. "Where's Danny?" she asked through her tears. "Where's my brother?" Marcus's face darkened. "He got sick that first winter. The people who took you two in, they weren't good people, Sarah. They didn't take proper care of him." Sarah's sobs grew harder. Her little brother, her sweet, funny little brother, who used to catch fireflies in mason jars and tell her stories about dragons and knights. "But that's why I'm here," Marcus continued. "I made a promise to your daddy before he died. I promised I'd look after you and Danny if anything happened to him. I failed with your brother, but I won't fail with you." Madame Lorraine had been watching this exchange with growing interest and growing concern. Emotional scenes were bad for business. They made the other girls restless and the customers uncomfortable. "That's a touching story," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "But it doesn't change the fact that Sarah owes me money. $800, to be exact." Marcus turned to face her, and suddenly, he didn't look gentle anymore. He looked dangerous, the kind of dangerous that came from years of hard living and harder choices. "I told you I'd pay it. 500 now, 300 later. But what guarantee do I have that you'll come back?" "My word." Lorraine laughed again, nastier this time. "Your word." "Mister, I've heard more promises in this place than there are stars in the sky. Promises don't pay bills." Sarah wiped her eyes and stepped forward. Her voice was stronger now, filled with something that had been sleeping for 15 years. "Hope. I'll work off the debt myself," she said. "Not the way I have been, but I can cook, clean, sew. I can take care of the books, manage supplies. I'm educated. My mother taught me to read and write, and cipher. This was true. Sarah Mitchell was one of the few girls in the establishment who could read. She'd been helping some of the other girls write letters to family, though most of them had no family left to write to. Marcus looked at her with something like pride. Here was the little girl he remembered. Smart, brave, and stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. That won't be necessary, he said firmly. I'll pay the debt. All of it. With what? Lorraine demanded. You said you only have 500. I'll mortgage my ranch. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. A man didn't mortgage his ranch unless he was desperate or crazy. In the West, a man's land was his life. Without it, he was nothing. Sarah gasped. Marcus, no, I won't let you do that. Not for me. Your daddy saved my life once, Marcus said quietly. During a bad storm, when the river flooded, I would have drowned if he hadn't pulled me out. I owe him this. I owe him more than this. The memory was clear as yesterday in Marcus's mind. He'd been trying to save some cattle that had gotten caught in the flood. The current swept him away, and he was going under for the third time when Thomas Mitchell's strong hand grabbed his collar and hauled him to safety. Besides, Marcus continued, looking directly at Sarah, I'm not doing this to own you. I'm doing this to free you. What you do after that is your choice. You can come to my ranch, or go anywhere else you want. You'll be free. Free. Sarah had almost forgotten what the word meant. For 15 years, she'd been owned by someone. First the family that took her in and treated her like a servant, then the man who bought her from them when she turned 18, then Madame Lorraine. Freedom seemed like a dream from another life. But Madame Lorraine wasn't finished. She'd built her business by being smarter and tougher than everyone else, and she hadn't survived this long by being sentimental. Even if I agreed to this arrangement, she said, her eyes calculating, there's still the matter of the other girls. Sarah leaving might give them ideas are bad for business. Marcus understood what she was really saying. She was worried about losing more girls, about an uprising, about her profitable little empire crumbling. I'm only here for Sarah, he said firmly. I'm not looking to cause trouble for anyone else. But trouble has a way of following good intentions, Lorraine replied, especially when those intentions involve taking my most popular girl. Sarah flinched at the words, most popular. She knew what that meant, and it made her feel sick. Marcus saw her reaction and felt anger rise in his chest like a prairie fire, but he kept his voice level. Name your price. $1,000. Cash. Tonight. The number hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. $1,000 was more money than most men saw in 5 years. It was more than his ranch was worth. It was impossible. But then he looked at Sarah's face, saw the hope dying in her eyes like a candle being snuffed out, saw her shoulders slump in defeat, and he made a decision that would change everything. I'll get your money, he said quietly. Lorraine smiled triumphantly. You have until midnight. If you don't have it by then, Sarah stays, and you never come back here again. Marcus nodded and turned toward the door. Sarah started to follow him, but Lorraine's sharp voice stopped her. Where do you think you're going? You stay here until I see my money. Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but she nodded. She'd learned long ago not to fight, when fighting would only make things worse. Marcus looked back at her one more time. I'll be back, he promised. I won't leave you here. Then he was gone, and the saloon slowly returned to normal. The piano started playing again. The card games resumed, but everyone was talking about the strange cowboy who wanted to buy a girl's freedom. Outside, Marcus stood in the dusty street and looked up at the stars. The night air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. $1,000. Where was he going to get $1,000 before midnight? He thought about his option. He could rob the bank, but that would make him an outlaw. And outlaws didn't live long in towns like Cedar Ridge. He could try to borrow it, But who had that kind of money to lend? Then he remembered something. A conversation he'd had with a man named William Garrett. Just last week, Garrett was a wealthy cattle buyer from back east. He'd offered to buy Marcus's entire herd, 200 head of prime beef cattle, for $800. Marcus had turned him down because he was hoping for a better price, but $800 plus the $500 he already had would make $1,300, enough to pay Lorraine and have some left over. The only problem was that Garrett had already left town. He was probably halfway to Denver by now. And Marcus remembered Garrett mentioning that he'd be stopping in Millerville, about 50 miles north, to look at another herd. If Marcus rode hard, he might be able to catch him. 50 miles there, 50 miles back, in less than 8 hours. On a horse that was already tired from the day's work. It was impossible, but Marcus Thompson had made a promise to a dying man 15 years ago, and he'd spent every day since then trying to keep that promise. He wasn't going to give up now. He walked quickly to the livery stable, where his horse Thunder was resting in a stall. Thunder was a big black gelding with white markings on his feet. He'd been Marcus's companion for 5 years, through cattle drives, and harsh winters, and lonely nights under the stars. "Sorry, boy," Marcus whispered, as he saddled the horse. "I know you're tired, but we got one more ride to make tonight." Thunder nickered softly and nuzzled Marcus's shoulder. It was almost like the horse understood. Within 10 minutes, Marcus was riding north, through the darkness. The moon was only a sliver, but the stars provided enough light to see the trail. Thunder's hooves drummed a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Mile after mile rolled by. Marcus pushed the horse as hard as he dared, but he was careful not to run him into the ground. If Thunder went lame, they'd both be stuck in the middle of nowhere. The night air whipped through Marcus's hair and stung his eyes. He thought about Sarah, waiting back at the saloon. Thought about the fear in her eyes when Lorraine said she had to stay. Thought about the little girl she used to be, laughing and playing in her father's fields. He thought about Thomas Mitchell and the promise he'd made, a promise to protect Thomas's children. He'd failed with Danny, but he wouldn't fail with Sarah. The miles stretched up. Marcus's back ached from the hard riding, and his legs were getting cramped. But he didn't slow down. Around 3 in the morning, he saw the lights of Millerville twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. His heart leaped with hope, but he tried not to get too excited. Garrett might not even be there. He rode straight to the town's only hotel and pounded on the door until a sleepy clerk appeared. "I'm looking for William Garrett," Marcus said, slightly out of breath. "Cattle buyer from Denver. Is he staying here?" The clerk rubbed his eyes and consulted his register. "Room 12. Upstairs." "But mister, it's 3 in the morning." Marcus was already taking the stairs 2 at a time. He knocked on the door of room 12. No answer. He knocked louder. "Go away," came a gruff voice from inside. "Come back in the morning, Mr. Garrett. It's Marcus Thompson, from Cedar Ridge. I need to talk to you about those cattle." There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps. The door opened to reveal a heavy-set man in a nightshirt, his gray hair sticking up at odd angles. "Thompson, what in blazes are you doing here at this ungodly hour?" "I need to sell those cattle. Tonight. Right now." Garrett stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Right now. It's the middle of the night. I know what time it is, but I need that money. And I need it now." $800. Like you offered. Something in Marcus's voice must have convinced Garrett that this was serious. The older man stepped back and gestured for Marcus to come in. "This better be good, Thompson." Marcus told him everything. About Sarah, about the promise he'd made, about the deadline he was racing against. Garrett listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each word. When Marcus finished, Garrett was quiet for a long moment. "You're risking everything for this girl," he finally said. "Your ranch, your herd, your future. Why?" Marcus thought about the question. How could he explain the weight of a 15-year-old promise? How could he describe the look in Thomas Mitchell's eyes as he lay dying? How could he make someone understand that some debts could only be paid with everything you had, because it's the right thing to do? He said simply. Garrett nodded slowly. I respect that. Stupid maybe, but I respect it. He walked to a small safe in the corner of the room and began turning the combination. Tell you what, Thompson, I'll give you the 800 for your cattle, but I'm also going to give you something else. He pulled out a stack of bills and counted off $800. Then he counted off 200 more. That's for being the kind of man who keeps his promises, Garrett said, handing Marcus the money. There aren't many of you left. Marcus stared at the money in his hands. $1,000. Exactly what he needed. I can't take the extra 200, he said. I didn't earn it. Sure you did. You earned it by being willing to give up everything for someone else. That's worth more than money. Garrett clasped Marcus on the shoulder. Now get out of here before I change my mind. Marcus shook the man's hand gratefully and ran back downstairs. Thunder was waiting where he'd left him, but the horse looked exhausted. His head was hanging low, and his sides were heaving. Just one more ride, boy, Marcus said, patting the horse's neck. Then we can rest. The ride back to Cedar Ridge was longer and harder than the ride north. Thunder was tired, and Marcus was fighting to stay awake in the saddle, but the money in his pocket kept him going. The sun was coming up as they rode into town. The streets were empty except for a few early risers. Heading to work, Marcus rode straight to the saloon, which was closed at this hour. He pounded on the door until Madame Lorraine appeared, looking irritated and not quite awake. You're early, she said, surprised. It's only 7 in the morning. I've got your money. Marcus held up the stack of bills. Lorraine's eyes widened. She'd been certain he wouldn't be able to come up with that much cash. She'd already started making plans for what she'd do when he failed. All of it. Every penny. She stepped back and let him in. The saloon looked different in the morning light. Sadder somehow. More worn around the edges. The smell of stale smoke and spilled liquor hung in the air like a bad memory. Sarah was sitting at a table in the corner, still wearing the blue silk dress from the night before. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. When she saw Marcus, her face lit up with hope and disbelief. You came back, she whispered. I told you I would. Marcus walked over to Madame Lorraine and placed the money on her desk. She counted it carefully, twice, making sure every bill was real. Well, she said finally, I have to admit, I'm impressed. Most men would have given up. I'm not most men. Lorraine nodded and walked to a filing cabinet. She pulled out a folder and removed a piece of paper. Sarah's contract. She tore it in half and threw the pieces in the fireplace. Sarah Mitchell, you're free to go. The words hung in the air like a prayer answer. Sarah stood up slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. For the first time in 15 years, she belonged to no one but herself. Marcus walked over to her and held out his arm, ready to go home. Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. Where is home? Wherever you want it to be. Together, they walked out of the saloon and into the morning sunlight. The air smelled like rain and new beginnings. Thunder was waiting patiently, and Marcus helped Sarah up onto the horse before climbing up behind her. As they rode through the streets of Cedar Ridge, people stopped to stare. Some looked disapproving, others curious. A few actually smiled and nodded, but Marcus didn't care what anyone thought. He'd kept his promise to Thomas Mitchell. He'd brought Sarah home. The ride to Marcus's ranch took 2 hours. Sarah was quiet most of the way, looking around at the countryside she hadn't seen in 15 years. Everything looked different, but somehow familiar too. Marcus's ranch was modest, but well kept. The house was small but comfortable, with a front porch and flower boxes under the windows. The barn was sturdy and freshly painted. Cattle grazed in the pastures, and chickens pecked around the yard. It's beautiful, Sarah said softly. It's not much, but it's honest work. Marcus helped her down from the horse. You can stay as long as you want. Or if you want to go somewhere else, I'll help you get started. Sarah looked around at the peaceful scene. After years in the noise and chaos of the saloon, the quiet was almost overwhelming. I don't know how to be free, she admitted. I don't remember what it's like to make my own choices. Marcus smiled gently. Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time. Over the next few months, Sarah slowly learned to live again. She helped Marcus around the ranch, cooking meals and mending clothes, and keeping the house clean. But it wasn't work in the way she'd known before. It was partnership. Marcus never asked for anything from her, except friendship. He gave her a room of her own, with a lock on the door that only she had the key to. He bought her simple, practical clothes to replace the silk dresses. He treated her with respect and kindness, never making her feel like she owed him anything. Slowly, Sarah began to heal. The haunted look left her eyes. She started to laugh again. Really laugh. The way she had when she was a child. She began to remember who she was underneath all the pain. And one evening, as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Sarah finally asked the question that had been on her mind for months. Why did you really do it, Marcus? And don't tell me it was just because of a promise to my father. Marcus was quiet for a long time, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and honest. Because I loved your family. Your parents were the closest thing to family I had, after my own folks died. And because he paused, searching for the right words. Because I've been in love with the memory of that little girl I used to know. The one who used to bring me cookies when I was working in the fields. The one who wasn't afraid of anything. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Marcus, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know you're free, Sarah. Free to stay, free to go, free to choose your own life, whatever makes you happy. Sarah reached over and took his hand. It was calloused and rough from years of hard work, but it was also gentle and warm. What if what makes me happy is staying right here? Marcus looked at her, hope blooming in his eyes like flowers in spring. Are you sure you could go anywhere, do anything? You could see the world. Sarah smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. I've seen enough of the world. What I want is a home, a real home, with someone who loves me for who I am, not what I can do for them. 6 months later, on a beautiful spring morning, when the wildflowers were blooming, and the air smelled like possibility, Marcus and Sarah were married by the circuit preacher in the little church in Cedar Ridge. Sarah wore a simple white dress that she'd sewn herself, and Marcus wore his best suit. They exchanged vows under the stained glass windows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. The people of Cedar Ridge came to accept their story, though it took time. Some folks never did understand why a man would risk everything for a woman's freedom, but Marcus and Sarah didn't care. They had each other, and that was enough. They built a good life together on that little ranch. They raised cattle and grew vegetables and filled their home with laughter. Sarah learned to read again. Really read for pleasure instead of just survival. Marcus taught her to ride, and rope, and handle a gun. And 5 years later, when their first child was born, a son they named Thomas, after Sarah's father, they finally had the family they'd both been searching for. The little boy grew up hearing the story of how his parents met, how his father bought his mother's freedom from a brothel, not because he wanted a woman, but because he wanted to keep a promise and give someone a chance at a real life. As Thomas grew older, he understood that his parents' love story wasn't like the fairy tales in books. It was messier, more complicated, born out of pain and loss, and the determination to do what was right, even when it cost everything. But it was also more beautiful because of that, because it was real. Marcus kept his promise to Thomas Mitchell that night in 1873. He protected Sarah, gave her freedom, and helped her find her way back to the person she was meant to be. And in doing so, He found something he'd been looking for his whole life. A family built not on blood or obligation, but on choice and love, and the courage to do what's right, even when the whole world is watching. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone isn't money or possessions or even love. Sometimes it's freedom, the freedom to choose their own path, make their own mistakes, and decide their own destiny. That's what Marcus gave Sarah that night. Not ownership, but freedom. Not control, but choice. Not a transaction, but a transformation. And that made all the difference. The sun was setting behind the mountains as this story comes to an end, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere on a ranch in the American West, a family sits down to dinner together. A family that exists because one man believed that everyone deserves a second chance at freedom. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, about courage and redemption and the power of doing what's right, even when it costs everything, you know what to do.